Putin has this story that he has told many times during his career. As a young boy playing on the streets of Leningrad, he and his friends made a game of chasing rats. One day, Putin found himself chasing a particularly large rat down a long corridor. He pursued the frightened animal until it reached a point where it could retreat no further. Suddenly, the rat lashed around and instead began chasing him. The terrified young boy fled down the stairs and into his mother's house, where he slammed the door in the rat's face. Years later in his autobiography, reminiscing on this story, Putin would remark, "There on that landing, I got a quick and lasting lesson in the meaning of the word cornered." I believe that Putin tells this story not to reflect on his small beginnings, but rather to tell others how dangerous a cornered Russia may be. So why am I telling you about this? Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine 9 months ago, I've been consuming all the information I can get my hands on to try and develop an understanding of this man and what it is that motivates him to feel justified in committing such terrible atrocities. In order to answer these questions, you need to have an understanding of Putin's life and the last half-century of Soviet history. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Soviet Union was expanding its influence westwards into Europe, installing governments aligned to the Soviet Union. This formed a dividing line down Europe that came to be known as the Iron Curtain. In order to combat the expansion of the USSR, in 1949 the West formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. 3 years later at St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad, Vladimir Putin was born. During his early life in the USSR, it was made up of 15 member states spanning 22 million square kilometers and was one of the world's great superpowers. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, setting off the first spark in a chain reaction that within 2 years would lead to the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, over in the West, in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, bringing together 12 member states to form the beginnings of the European Union. In 1999, Putin was appointed as Prime Minister by then-President Boris Yeltsin. In December of that year, Boris Yeltsin suddenly resigned, appointing Putin as the interim president. At that time, Putin was riding high in the polls off the back of his vicious crackdown of separatists in the breakaway region of Chechnya. In May of 2020, Putin is elected president with 71% of the vote. From here, Putin begins to assert his control over the oligarchs, going as far as to imprison one of Russia's richest men, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in what many consider to be a show trial. When Putin put Mikhail in a literal cage, he wasn't just imprisoning a man, but sending a message: you can be my ally, or you can be my prisoner. Come 2008, Putin's domination of the Russian state would have to be put on the back burner, as the Russian constitution sets a consecutive limit for presidents of 2 terms. Putin stepped back into the role of prime minister, instead staying behind the scenes, exerting influence over his hand-picked successor, Dmitry Medvedev. In 2012, Putin again ran for president and was elected to power in what many believe to have been a rigged election. Later on in Ukraine, in 2014, President Viktor Yanukovych, who was besieged by corruption allegations, was negotiating an economic partnership with the EU. At the last minute, however, likely due to Russian influence, he made the snap decision to go against the vote of his parliament and scrapped the deal, instead taking a bailout from Russia. This led to a wave of mass protests right across the country, which ended with Yanukovych being evicted from office. In retaliation for this, Putin began his annexation of the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. So that's who Putin is as a man, and how he found himself wielding an iron grip over the Russian state and occupying another European nation. I now want to take a look with you at what might be going on in Putin's mind. I just want to make clear before we dive in that anything that we're about to discuss is not in any way a justification of his actions, but rather an attempt to get inside his head and understand what allows him to commit such terrible atrocities. Putin's position is a tenuous one. He may sit at the top of Russia's power structure, but it's only through both the support and the subservience of the oligarchs that he's able to remain in authority. In the immediate aftermath of Putin's annexation of Crimea, his approval ratings spiked. It was at this point that Putin realised what a powerful propaganda tool war and the threat of an outsider can be. Following his annexation of Crimea, he funded further unrest in eastern Ukraine, providing weapons to separatist rebels in the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. All this comes to a head in early 2022 when Putin sent Russian troops into Ukraine. In the early days following the invasion, as Putin predicted, again his polling numbers jumped. So there's a big part of this invasion that for Putin may have originally been seen as a pragmatic act of self-preservation. But there's another level to this, which for Putin is deeply personal. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, it's hard to understate the impact that this had on him. In 2 short years, his nation had been reduced from one of the 2 global superpowers to a fractured country with its economy in freefall. This division didn't only upend Putin's world on the basis of economics and power, but also severed the deep cultural and historical ties that had been established between the states of the Soviet Union. Just to give you an idea of how deep this runs, in Ukraine, the land within its borders was actually where the Russian Federation had its origins. There are also deep linguistic ties, with the majority in the east of Ukraine speaking Russian and not Ukrainian. Just because these new borders had been put up did not lead Putin to view these lands as independent states, but rather waylaid parts of the Soviet Union. Putin even went as far as to publish a 5,000-word essay laying out beat by beat Russia and Ukraine's shared history in a bid to argue that, in his words, we are one people. In 2005, Putin gave this famous speech to the Russian parliament that I think gives a real window into his mind.
Прежде всего следует признать, и об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века. Для российского же народа оно стало настоящей драмой. Десятки миллионов наших сограждан и соотечественников оказались за пределами российской территории.
Translation: these 14 regions that broke away and formed their own nations with distinct cultures, languages and political systems. No, these are not proper countries, but rather just waylaid parts of the Soviet Union, waiting to be taken back into Russia's embrace. I believe that it is this very mindset which is informing Putin's behaviour towards Ukraine. After the fall of the Soviet Union, not only did Putin find himself living in a nation where millions of his own compatriots were stranded outside of the heart of the motherland, but there was an even greater threat to post-Soviet unity growing on his doorstep. Throughout Putin's life, NATO would continue to expand decade by decade, even beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the early years of his presidency, Putin was somewhat able to handle the expansion of NATO, and even at times enjoyed friendly relations with the West.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
But in 2004, his tolerant approach to the West started to shift. That year, 2 things happened. The 3 formerly Soviet states of Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia joined both the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. After the eviction of Ukraine's corrupt president Yanukovych, the country's following 2 presidents were openly pro-West. So now, not only was the West encroaching behind the fallen Iron Curtain, but now they were leading astray the birthplace of the Russian motherland, the land whose citizens Putin considers to be of one people with his own. This, for Putin, was a red line. Not only does Putin see these former Soviet lands drifting away from Russia, but he believes that this is happening to them because, as he writes in his essay, of the deliberate efforts by those forces that have always sought to undermine our unity. In Putin's eyes, the meaning of the word cornered. In order to better understand how all this is making Putin feel, let's turn the tables on the West and view this from the context of an alternate history. In our split timeline, call it, I don't know, Earth 838, the Soviet Union never collapsed. collapsed, but rather in the late 20th century, America had 14 of its states break away and form their own separate nations. Imagine that over time these nations started growing closer to the USSR and adopting communist attitudes and eventually joining a Russia-led military alliance. How do you think that America would feel in these circumstances? Now imagine that this America was run by a narcissistic despot with poor judgment and a quick temper. You know, if you can imagine such a thing. It's not hard to imagine that under these circumstances, there would be many in America who would consider the Soviet presence as a malevolent force and come to view this ending of troops not as an invasion, but rather as a liberation. It's this mindset that I believe is what is allowing Putin to justify his actions in Ukraine. He's a man haunted by the fall of the Soviet Union, whose main goal in life has been to reverse, as he puts it, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. I can only hope that both his presidency and the occupation of Ukraine are approaching their final days. Right, this whole project has been quite the rabbit hole, but there's so much more that I want to tell you about Putin, Russia, and his invasion of Ukraine. One question that I found myself particularly fascinated by is if, God forbid, this invasion goes Putin's way, where will be its next target? It's this question that I'm going to be looking at in my next video, so if you want to learn about that, then please do consider subscribing. Before I go, I just want to give a quick shout out to two other creators. Here at the track record, I recently passed 700 subscribers, and a big part of that was due to both the Present Past and Assumations kindly sharing my content with their subscribers. Assumations does a lot of really interesting YouTube shorts, and the Present Past recently had a meteoric rise to fame with this video on Johnny Harris, and is making lots more interesting content. If you want to check out either of these two, then I'll link to their channels down below, and thanks for watching.